The first thing Claire Ashford noticed about Blackwood Farm was the locks. Not the sagging roofline of the Victorian farmhouse, though it drooped to the left like a man too tired to stand straight. Not the fields, which had surrendered entirely to briar patches and dead thistle thorns, thick as fingers clawing up through the November frost. Not even the smell, that particular combination of mildew and cold ash and decades of sealed-off air that hit her the moment she stepped out of her Honda Civic and breathed in the property that was now somehow hers. The locks. Every door on the property, from the farmhouse front entrance to the rotting garden shed 60 feet from the main structure, was secured with a Medico Series 3 deadbolt. Chrome and precise, each one caught the pale afternoon light like a small, arrogant announcement. Claire knew what those locks cost because she had priced them once when she was outfitting her bakery on North Clark Street in Chicago. $420 per unit minimum. She had laughed at the price tag and bought something cheaper. Edmund Blackwood had not bought something cheaper. Edmund Blackwood, who had lived without functional indoor plumbing for the last 11 years of his life, who had heated a single room with a wood stove while the rest of the Victorian house rotted around him, who had died in a narrow iron bed with a cracked ceiling above him and newspapers stacked to his shoulders on either side, had installed $400 locks on every door he owned. Claire stood in the frozen November mud and stared at the lock on the garden shed for a long time. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and unfolded the small square of paper that attorney Graham Wells had tucked into the envelope along with the keys. The handwriting was Edmund's, unmistakably, the letters jagged and pressing hard into the page, the way very old men write when their hands have forgotten how to be gentle. Don't sell before you look carefully at the floor of the old storage barn. That was all. No explanation, no follow-up. Just that single instruction, delivered from beyond the grave by a man who had always preferred to be cryptic when he could have been clear. Claire folded the note back into her pocket, picked up her duffel bag, and walked toward the farmhouse. She had been back in Harlow County for 3 days. Before that, she had been in Chicago, sitting across from a bankruptcy attorney who smelled of microwave coffee and quiet disappointment, signing her name to the end of everything she had built over 4 years. The bakery on North Clark Street was gone. The lease was gone. The equipment had been sold at auction for 60 cents on the dollar. What remained was $60,000 in business loan debt that would follow her for years, and a credit score that looked like something had taken a hammer to it. She had driven to the reading of Edmund's will on $40 of gas money, and the vague, shameful hope that a man she had genuinely loved might have left her something useful. The office of attorney Graham Wells occupied the second floor of a building in Harlow that also contained a tax preparation service and a dentist's office. Wells himself was a lean, careful man in his early 60s, the kind of lawyer who had spent decades in estate law and had developed the professional skill of delivering catastrophic news in a tone so neutral it took a moment to register. Sitting across the conference table from Claire were her Aunt Margaret Harlow and Margaret's son Victor. Margaret was wearing cashmere, a shade of deep burgundy that looked expensive even in the flat fluorescent light of the conference room. Victor was wearing a suit that cost more than Claire's monthly rent had been, and he checked his watch with the rhythmic persistence of a man who has decided that demonstrating his own importance is worth the social cost. Neither of them had visited Edmund in the last 4 years. Claire knew this because she had visited 3 times, driving up from Chicago on weekends she couldn't afford to lose from the bakery. She had sat on the porch with Edmund in the summer heat and listened to him talk about his father, about the land, about things she had not fully understood at the time. She had brought him books and good bread and once, memorably, a jar of good Kentucky bourbon that he had accepted without comment and placed on a shelf where she could see it, but he never opened it in front of her. None of that had felt like an investment. It had just felt like the right thing to do. Wells read the will in his measured, dust-dry voice. Margaret received Edmund's commercial real estate portfolio in Manhattan, the liquid assets in the First National Trust. Victor received the shares in the tech syndicate and the vintage automobile collection, 6 cars, the least valuable of which was appraised at $240,000. When Wells reached Claire's name, he paused in the way that people pause when they know what they are about to say will land badly, and they are giving the room a moment to prepare. To my grandniece, Claire Ashford, I leave Blackwood Farm in its entirety, including all structures, the acreage, and everything contained within the property lines from the sky above to the bedrock below. The silence in the room had a texture to it. Then Victor laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was the kind of laugh that is designed to land like a hand across the face. Blackwood Farm. He shook his head slowly, the amusement on his face shading into something more calculated. That wreck in the Catskills. Claire, that property hasn't had $1 of maintenance since Reagan was in office. The foundation is cracked. The soil is dead. The house is a teardown. Congratulations. You inherited a liability. Margaret reached across and touched her son's arm, a gesture that looked like restraint, but was closer to staging. Claire, dear. Her voice was warm in the way that very cold things sometimes appear warm when the contrast is sharp enough. If you find yourself overwhelmed by the demolition costs, Victor and I would be happy to discuss something. A small arrangement, reasonable terms. Claire did not answer either of them. She was watching Graham Wells, who had not yet turned the page. He cleared his throat quietly and looked up. Before we conclude, there is one additional matter. Mr. Blackwood asked that I read the following on the record. He lifted a separate sheet. The bequest of Blackwood Farm is unconditional and irrevocable. The subterranean rights, mineral rights, and rights to all structures and contents are included without exception or limitation. Any legal challenge to this instrument will be met with the attached notarization witnessed by 2 independent parties before federal judge Harold Marsh, executed 11 days before my death. Wells set the page down and looked at Victor over the top of his glasses. Victor had stopped laughing. He had not known about the federal notarization. That much was clear from the shift in his expression, a brief but unmistakable moment where the confidence slipped and something harder and colder showed underneath. He leaned toward Ellis Cobb, the attorney he had brought with him, a compact man in a slightly cheap suit who had the look of someone perpetually calculating angles. They murmured together for a moment. Margaret's hand found her pearl necklace. Wells completed the formalities. Claire signed the transfer documents, accepted the ring of iron keys from Wells' desk, and walked out of the office into the November air without speaking to either of them again. She heard Margaret's voice behind her as she reached the door, directed at Victor, low but not low enough. It doesn't matter. She'll sell inside of 6 months. When she does, we'll be ready. Claire did not turn around. She kept walking. But standing now in the frozen mud of Blackwood Farm, looking at those locks, she found herself thinking about Edmund's note again. Don't sell before you look carefully at the floor of the old storage barn. Not consider keeping the property. Not there may be something valuable here. Just look at the floor. She went inside. The interior of the farmhouse was everything she had feared and a little worse. Edmund had spent his final years in the first-floor sitting room, which he had turned into a combination bedroom and storage facility. The rest of the house had been left to the particular slow violence of a New England winter repeated over many decades. Plaster ceilings had buckled and stained. Floorboards had swollen and split. In the hallway near the kitchen, a section of wall had gone soft with water infiltration, the plaster crumbling to reveal the lath beneath, and through the lath, Claire could see pale winter light from outside. The house breathed cold air through its walls like an old man with a bad chest. She set her duffel down on the cleanest spot she could find and spent the first night in a sleeping bag on the sitting room floor, listening to the house settle and groan around her. Her camping lantern throwing orange shadows up the walls, her phone charging from the one outlet she had confirmed still worked. She did not sleep well, but she did not leave. In the morning, she walked the property. The barn stood about 90 feet behind the main house, separated by what had once been a kitchen garden, and was now an impenetrable tangle of dead growth. It was older than the house by at least 30 years, built from stone and heavy timber in the late 19th century. The roof had partially collapsed, pulling one wall inward with it, and the debris had settled into a dense, compressed mass of rotted shingles, broken timber, and accumulated decades of weather and neglect. but the structure itself, the thick stone walls had held. Claire walked around the entire perimeter twice. On the second pass, she stopped at the northeast corner of the barn, the section furthest from the collapsed roof, and looked down at the ground. She took one step forward and pressed her boot into the earth. The sound that came back was wrong. Not the flat, absorbed thud of packed soil, but something with resonance in it, a faint, hollow reverberation that traveled up through her boot sole and into the bones of her foot. She stepped back, pressed again, the same sound. She stood there looking at the ground for a long time, at her breath fogging in the cold air. Then she took out Edmund's note and read it again and put it back in her pocket. She called the number on the card that Daniel Holt had left on the notice board at Miller's Hardware in town. He answered on the second ring. She described the address, and there was a pause on the line. Not a long one. 2, maybe 3 seconds. "I know that property," he said. His voice was careful, and she could not read anything in it. He arrived the following morning in a truck the color of faded mint, a backhoe secured to the flatbed with orange, strapping the machine scratched and dented, but clearly maintained with the kind of attention that working equipment earns. Daniel Holt himself was a broad-shouldered man in his middle 30s, not tall but solid, in a way that suggested he had been doing physical work his entire adult life and had never considered stopping. He had a permanent squint from working outdoors, and his hands, when he shook hers, felt like the sole of a work boot. He looked at the farmhouse. He looked at the barn. Then he looked at Claire with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite judgment. It was the look of a man taking an accurate measurement. "Edmund Blackwood," Pretty said. "He was your family." "My great-uncle." She studied him. "You know the name?" "My father worked here for a couple of weeks, back in 1983. He paused, and something moved behind his eyes, a controlled thing. "Edmund fired him. No explanation. My father never understood why. He carried that for the rest of his life." The silence between them had some weight in it. "Will you still take the job?" Claire asked. Daniel Holt looked past her at the barn. He looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. "Yes," he said, "I'll take it." For the next 2 weeks they worked. Claire sorted salvage while Daniel operated the backhoe, methodically dismantling the collapsed section of the barn roof and dragging the debris out into the dead field behind the structure. The work had a rhythm to it, and the rhythm kept her from thinking too hard about the property tax bill, $12,000 due to the county clerk's office in less than 8 weeks, or about Victor's voice in the attorney's office, or about the $60,000 in debt that existed as a permanent background noise in the back of her mind. On the second afternoon, a woman named Donna Price arrived. Claire had called 3 local real estate agents. 2 had declined before she described the property in full. Donna was the third. She was a heavy-set woman in her 50s who walked the property line with the brisk efficiency of someone who has seen enough failing farms to have stopped feeling anything about them. She brought a man with her. He introduced himself as Blake Morrison, a specialist in contaminated land remediation based in Albany. He had a clean haircut and a business card with an embossed logo, and he did not look at the house when he got out of the car. He looked at the barn. He looked at the northeast corner of the barn specifically. Donna gave her assessment without embellishment. The soil in the surrounding acreage had been compromised by agricultural chemical runoff from an industrial operation upstream in the early 1970s. Nothing could be grown on it. The house was a teardown. The foundation had shifted and cracked. Best realistic price, given years to find the right buyer, was around $20,000. "We may be able to help move things along," Morrison said. His tone was pleasant and entirely controlled. "My company specializes in exactly this kind of situation. We could take the property off your hands immediately, absorb the tax liability. You'd walk away clean." "How much?" Claire asked. $18,000, given the remediation costs we'd be assuming. Claire looked at him. He was still not looking at the barn. He was looking at her. "You said this was your first time on the property," she said. "That's right. But you came directly to the barn when you got out of the car, before you looked at anything else." Morrison's pleasant expression did not change. It was the smoothness of it that told her something. "Just taking in the overall layout," he said. Claire thanked them both for their time and declined the offer. After Donna's car disappeared down the mountain road, Claire walked to the northeast corner of the barn and looked at the ground. Then she looked at the area around it. In the dead grass, pressing close to the stone foundation, she found something that made her go still. Footprints. Several sets from multiple visits, judging by the different depths and the degree to which some had been pressed down by weather. Someone had stood here in this exact spot for an extended period. The marks were not from today. The edges had softened with cold and partial frost, suggesting they were at minimum several days old. Some were older than that. Morrison had been here before, and he had not come alone. Claire went back into the farmhouse and opened the bottom drawer of the desk in Edmund's sitting room, the one she had not yet cleared. Under a sheaf of utility bills from 1994 and a single expired coupon for a hardware store that had closed before she was born, she found a photograph. Black and white printed on the thick paper stock of the early 1930s. Two figures stood in front of a building with red brick walls and large wooden doors. The taller figure was a man in his 40s, broad through the shoulder, wearing work clothes, and looking at the camera with an expression of restrained pride. The shorter figure was a boy of perhaps 8 years old, dark-haired, serious-faced, standing close to the man, but not quite touching him. Claire turned the photograph over. The handwriting on the back was faded, and she had to tilt it toward the window light. Henry and Me, 1931, before they came. She looked at the building in the background. The red brick, the large wooden doors. Her eyes went to the window. She looked out at the barn. It was the barn. The photograph had been taken in front of the barn, 40 feet closer than it stood now, before whatever element of the structure had once been there was built or attached. The boy in the photograph was Edmund, which meant the man was Henry Blackwood, Edmund's father. And the line on the back, before they came. Before who came? She was still holding the photograph when Daniel knocked on the door frame the following morning to tell her the backhoe had a problem in the northeast corner of the barn. The machine had hit something. The teeth of the bucket had sheared against it with a sound he described as metal on metal. He was calm when he said it. Professionally calm, the way a man is calm when he already suspects what he has found and is not yet ready to say it out loud. They dug with shovels, the two of them, in the mud and the cold, while the sky turned the greenish gray of a coming storm. Claire's spade hit it first. The shock of it traveled up through the handle and into her wrists. They cleared the remaining earth by hand. It was a steel door. Not a hatch, not a panel. A vault door, circular, measuring nearly 6 feet across, embedded flush in a thick perimeter of poured concrete and set horizontally into the earth beneath the barn floor. The metal was pitted and oxidized to a deep rust orange over most of its surface, but it was completely intact. At its center was a wheel-style locking mechanism, cold and solid, under Claire's gloved hand, secured by a padlock the size of her fist. Daniel crouched beside it and pressed one palm flat against the steel. He didn't speak for a moment. "This is ordnance-grade steel," he said quietly. "Mid-century construction, may be older. You don't pour this kind of concrete perimeter for a root cellar. You don't build this kind of door for storage." He paused. "You build this to survive something catastrophic, or to hide something you're not willing to lose." Claire thought of Edmund in his narrow iron bed with the cracked ceiling. She thought of $400 locks on a shed that held nothing but gardening tools. She thought of the note, "Don't sell before you look carefully at the floor of the old storage barn." She thought of Morrison's footprints in the dead grass pressed into the frozen ground over multiple visits, a man standing in the cold and looking down at the earth and calculating. "We need to open it," she said. Daniel looked at the padlock. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she couldn't fully read, a combination of reluctance and the particular kind of resolve that men arrive at when they have decided that going forward is more honest than going back. "Once we open it," he said, "we don't get to not know what's down there." "I know," Claire said. He went to his truck for the angle grinder. While he was gone, Claire stood alone beside the door in the dying afternoon light, one hand still resting on the cold steel wheel. The rain began to come down harder, turning the crater they had dug into a shallow pool of cold mud. She was thinking about her father, who had told her once that Edmund was the strangest man he had ever met, and had meant it as a criticism. She was thinking about Victor's voice, smooth with contempt, saying, "You inherited a liability. She was thinking about $60,000 and a property tax bill and a bakery that no longer existed. And she was thinking about a boy standing in front of a barn in 1931, not quite touching his father looking at a camera, with an expression too serious for a child of 8. A boy who would grow into a man who lived for 60 years in deliberate squalor, who installed military-grade locks on shed doors, who wrote a single cryptic instruction on a scrap of paper and tucked it into an envelope with the keys to everything he owned. A man who trusted her, specifically her with whatever was down there. The angle grinder started up with a scream. Sparks cascaded down into the mud in long orange arcs. The rain hissed against them as they fell. Claire Ashford stood in the storm and waited. The padlock gave way at 9:47 in the evening. Claire knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock on her phone the way a person watches it when they are afraid that if they stop counting the minutes, something will slip away from them. The angle grinder had eaten through 2 cutting discs. Daniel's arms were shaking with the sustained effort of holding the tool steady against metal that had been fused by decades of rust and pressure, and the sparks falling into the mud around them had long since stopped looking dramatic and started looking like the last efforts of something that simply refused to quit. Then the padlock dropped into the mud with a sound like a stone thrown into deep water, and Daniel stepped back and said nothing, and the rain came down on both of them in the silence that followed. He wedged the iron pry bar into the spokes of the wheel. Claire took the other side without being asked. The wheel did not move. She threw her weight against it, boots sliding in the mud, and the steel gave nothing. Daniel reset his grip and said, "Again," and she pushed until she felt something tear in her left shoulder, and still the wheel held. Then from somewhere deep in the mechanism, something shifted. A single degree of movement. Then two. The grinding resistance of it traveled through the bar and into her hands like a current. And then the wheel turned slowly at first and then faster until it locked into the open position with a clunk that she felt more than heard. The pressurized hiss that followed was not what she expected. She had been bracing for something chemical, something sharp and dangerous, the kind of smell that sends you stumbling backward. Instead, the air that exhaled from the seam of the door was warm, relative to the November night, and it smelled of charred oak and dark caramel and something older underneath a sweetness that sat at the back of the throat like a memory of something good. Daniel attached the backhoe chain to the door handle and climbed into the cab. The machine reversed slowly, the chain went taut, and the massive door pivoted upward on its hinges with a groan that the whole farm seemed to feel. A square of absolute darkness opened in the earth beneath him. Daniel shone his LED flashlight down into the hole. The beam caught a wide concrete staircase, reinforced each step, precise and level, descending into the earth at a slight angle before curving out of sight. Along the walls, heavy copper wiring ran in neat conduit brackets, green with age but intact. The staircase was not the construction of a man improvising a hiding place. It was the work of someone who had planned carefully over time with intention. "How deep do you think it goes?" Claire asked. Daniel moved the flashlight slowly. Only one way to find out. She went first. The stairs counted 50 steps before they reached a secondary door. This one iron riveted along its edges, standing slightly ajar. The air grew warmer as they descended, warmer and heavier and more intensely fragrant, and by the time they reached the bottom, Claire was breathing through her mouth because the smell was so concentrated, it felt like something she could hold in her hands. Daniel found the breaker panel beside the iron door, traced the conduit back toward the entrance, and spent 20 minutes running the generator's extension cord down the shaft, while Claire stood alone in the near dark with the flashlight and the smell and the particular quality of silence that belongs to spaces that have been sealed for a very long time. She was not afraid. So that surprised her. She had expected fear, or at least the cautious version of it that presents itself as sensible hesitation. Instead, she felt something she had not felt in months, not since before the bakery began its long, slow failure, not since before the debt and the bankruptcy and the grinding daily arithmetic of a life coming apart. She felt awake. Daniel called down that he was ready. She heard him splice the feed into the old breaker panel with the careful focus of a man who respects electricity. "Brace yourself," he said. Then he threw the lever. The lights came on row by row. They were industrial Edison bulbs. Heavy glass mounted in steel cages along the ceiling at regular intervals, and they flickered to life in a sequence that moved from the entrance toward the far end of the chamber like a slow wave of amber fire. The space they revealed was so far beyond what Claire had imagined that she stood at the bottom of the stairs and simply could not move for several seconds. The vault was the size of a professional basketball court, perhaps larger. Soaring brick arches supported the ceiling, mortared with the kind of precision that belonged to a different era of craftsmanship, each arch reinforced at its crown with a steel I-beam that had been painted black at some point and had since faded to a deep charcoal. The floor was poured concrete, smooth and level, slightly damp but structurally sound, and filling it row upon row, tier upon tier, stretching from the iron door to the far brick wall, in a grid so orderly it looked deliberate as a library were the racks. Each rack was steel-framed 4 tiers high, and each tier cradled massive glass vessels, 5 gallons each, sealed with dark red wax that had hardened to the consistency of old leather. The glass was thick and slightly green-tinted, the kind made in American glassworks before the Second World War. Inside each vessel, catching the amber light from above and holding it, was a liquid the color of old honey pulled toward gold. There were thousands of them. Daniel walked down the central aisle without speaking his footsteps, the only sound in the enormous space. Claire followed. She ran her fingertips along the wax seal of the nearest vessel without pressing hard enough to disturb it, and the red surface was smooth and cold, and faintly gritty with settled dust. Along the walls between the rack supports, long planks of darkened wood were fixed at eye level, covered from end to end in handwritten notations. Temperature readings in Fahrenheit recorded twice daily. Humidity percentages, brief sensory descriptions of a few words, each terse and technical, written in a hand that changed slightly over the years, but remained controlled throughout. This was Henry Blackwood's climate log, maintained by hand across the entire operational life of the vault, a record of vigilance so sustained it constituted a kind of devotion. The amber liquid in those vessels had been distilled from rye grain, put into charred oak barrels, and aged to its peak before Henry transferred it here. Glass neither absorbs nor releases. The chemistry inside each vessel locked in place at the moment Henry Blackwood decided it was ready, and there it had remained unchanged for 90 years, while the world above fell apart and put itself back together and changed into something neither Henry nor Edmund had lived to see. Claire understood this not from what she had read, but from what she was looking at. The discipline of the log, the uniformity of the seals, the care with which each vessel had been positioned so that its wax stamp faced outward and was readable from the aisle. This was not hoarding. This was preservation. These were two entirely different things. Near the center of the vault, on a support post that had been sanded smooth on one face, someone had carved a name into the wood with a blade. The letters were neat and deliberate, not hurried. W. Costello, 1933. Below it, in smaller letters that required Claire to lean close, a second line, "I came to take, I left because I could not." She stared at it, read it twice, stood back. "Daniel," she said. He came over, looked at the carving, and said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Edmund's letter is in the office," she said. "Let's go read it." The glass-walled office was at the far end of the vault, elevated on a raised iron platform with a grated metal staircase. Inside, preserved by the same controlled conditions that had kept the whiskey intact, were a mahogany desk, 2 green glass banker's lamps, a disconnected rotary telephone, and in the corner a Mosler safe, its heavy door standing open and empty. On the leather desk blotter, weighted by a smooth river stone, was a thick leather-bound ledger. Resting on top of the ledger was an envelope sealed with dark wax, addressed in Edmund's handwriting, "To the one who digs." Claire broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. Edmund's handwriting was the same as on the note she had found at the farm, jagged and pressured, a man writing with urgency even in the apparent calm of composition. She read it aloud because it felt wrong to read it silently, because Daniel was there, and what it contained belonged to both of them in a way she was already beginning to understand. Edmund wrote about his father Henry, who had been the finest rye distiller in the Catskills, and had built this vault over 3 years in the late 1920s, finishing it just before Prohibition made his operation technically unnecessary, since the operation had never been technically legal. He wrote about the Costello Syndicate, which had provided capital in the early years and distribution into New York, and about the dissolution of that partnership in 1933, when Prohibition ended and the whiskey became legal property and therefore worth fighting over. He wrote about his father's death, the cut brake line, the road down the mountain. He had been 18 years old. And then there was a passage that changed the shape of everything that came before it. In 1978, a man came to Blackwood Farm. He said he was a local historian with an interest in Prohibition-era distilling operations in the Catskills. He asked about my father. I told him nothing and asked him to leave. In 1983, his son came. Same name, Morrison. The son was more careful, more patient. He spent time in town. He spoke to my hired man, the carpenter, a Mr. Holt. I do not believe Holt was disloyal deliberately, but I saw them talking near the barn, and I could not afford the distinction between deliberate and accidental. I let Holt go without explanation. The Morrisons are not historians. They are the inheritors of the Costello operation, or what remained of it after the syndicate collapsed. They have not forgotten what their family once claimed a share of, and they have never stopped looking. Claire stopped reading. She looked up at Daniel. He was very still. His jaw had the particular set of a man absorbing something that reorders what he thought he knew. Your father wasn't let go because of anything he did, Claire said. He was let go because Edmund saw him talking to Morrison and couldn't take the risk. Daniel's voice was flat and even. My father thought he had failed at something. He thought Edmund had seen something wrong in him. He never knew what it was. The silence in the glass-walled office was the kind that follows the correction of a long injustice. It did not feel like relief. It felt like grief that had finally found the right shape. I'm sorry, Claire said. Daniel looked out through the glass at the rows of amber light stretching toward the far wall. He nodded once slowly. Then he said, finish the letter. She finished it. Edmund had spent 60 years maintaining the performance of poverty and eccentricity because he believed with the absolute conviction of a traumatized 18-year-old who had watched his father die that the moment anyone knew the vault was real and full, the people who wanted it would come. He had made himself invisible by making himself worthless. He had protected the vault by becoming the thing no one wanted to inherit. The last line of the letter, this liquid is the blood of my family. Protect it, and forgive me for asking. Claire folded the pages carefully and set them back on the desk. Her phone rang. She answered without checking the name because there was only one person who had been calling her repeatedly for the past 3 days. Victor's voice was pleasant in the practiced way of someone who has decided that pleasantness is currently the most strategic option. He was just checking in. He was worried about her out there alone on the property. He had heard from someone in town that she had hired a contractor some excavation work. Had she found anything interesting? Just clearing debris, Claire said. Of course. A pause that lasted one beat too long. Claire, I want you to know that if you're finding this all too much to manage, there's no shame in reconsidering. The offer stands. We could have someone look at the property this week. I appreciate that, Victor. She hung up. She looked at Daniel. He was already looking at her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He turned the screen toward her. It was a photograph he had taken in town that morning from his truck through the windshield. Two men standing on the sidewalk outside Miller's Hardware, close together, the angle of their bodies indicating a private conversation. One was Victor Harlow. The other was Blake Morrison. They knew each other. Not the casual acquaintance of men who happen to meet in a small town, but the body language of people who have spoken before and have specific things to discuss. Victor had not come to Harlow County out of concern for Claire. He had come because Morrison had told him something was happening at the farm, and the two of them had coordinated what to do about it. Morrison wants the vault, Claire said. Yes, Ryan. Victor wants the property. They need each other to get either. And you have 48 hours before the tax deadline, Daniel said. If you miss it, the county places a lien. Victor buys the lien. He gets the land. Morrison gets what he came for. Claire stood very still in the glass-walled office and looked out at the 10,000 vessels of 90-year-old whiskey glowing in the amber light, and she thought about what all of it was worth and how little time she had, and how surgically the trap had been built around her. The property tax bill had seemed like simple bad luck when she arrived. Now she understood it was a deadline that someone had been counting on. She called Daniel's contact at 11 that night. Stuart Crane answered on the first ring, which told her he had been expecting the call, which told her that Daniel had said more than Claire had asked him to say. She filed that away and said nothing about it. There was no room right now for anything that wasn't the immediate problem. She described the vault in plain terms: the scale, the condition, the seals. She read him the stamp on the nearest vessel from memory: Blackwood Reserve, distilled 1924, bottled 1933. She told him what Edmund's letter said about the Costello connection and the circumstances of the bottling. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that she checked the phone to confirm the call was still active. "I'll be there by midnight," Stuart said. He arrived in a black SUV with private plates and a leather briefcase that had the worn, precise look of a tool used seriously for a long time. He was silver-haired, lean through the face, dressed in a charcoal suit that acknowledged its surroundings not at all. He walked the muddy path from the driveway to the barn opening without adjusting his pace for the terrain, and when Daniel led him down the stairs and the lights came on and the vault revealed itself, Stuart Crane stopped walking and stood completely still for nearly 2 full minutes. He did not say anything during those 2 minutes. He simply looked slowly, methodically, the way a man looks at something he needs to understand fully before he allows himself to react to it. Then he set his briefcase on the nearest rack frame and opened it. He extracted a vessel from the rack himself, cradling it with both hands, and carried it to the office desk. He used a heated surgical scalpel to pierce the wax seal with a cut so precise it barely disturbed the surrounding surface. He drew exactly 1 ounce of the amber liquid into a glass pipette and transferred it to a crystal tasting glass he had brought in his case. He did not rush the evaluation. He held the glass to the light, first examining color and clarity. He breathed it twice, long and slow, his eyes closed. Then he tasted it, and he was still for a full minute afterward, the glass resting in both hands, his expression the careful neutral of a man managing a strong reaction. When he opened his eyes, they had a quality Claire had not seen in them before. Something close to the expression people have in churches. "Flawless," he said, and his voice was quieter than it had been. "The chemistry is exactly where Henry Blackwood left it 90 years ago." He set the glass down. "If you bring this collection to Sotheby's with a full provenance catalog, 6 months of proper documentation, the realized total could reach $80 million. "I have 48 hours, Claire said. Stuart looked at her steadily. "3 vessels, he said. $500,000 cash tonight, in exchange for exclusive rights to manage the auction of the remainder." "Done." They spent the next hour crating the 3 vessels in padded foam and loading them into the back of Stuart's SUV with the care of men handling things irreplaceable, which was what they were. Stuart counted the money himself, banded hundreds in a leather satchel, and handed it to Claire with the directness of someone who considers ceremony a waste of time. She walked out of this barn with the satchel in both hands, and then Stuart Crane paused at the barn entrance and looked back, and something crossed his face. He was looking at the post with the carved name, W. Costello, 1933. "You recognize it," Claire said. It was not a question. Stuart looked at her. A calculation moved behind his eyes, brief and controlled. "I know the family name," he said. "Finish the transaction before morning. Don't sign anything else with me or anyone else until you know exactly who I represent." Then he walked to his SUV and drove away down the mountain road. Claire stood in the dark with $500,000 in her hands and tried to understand what he had just told her. Not a warning against him specifically, Something more careful than that. A piece of information delivered in the only form he was willing to use the shape of what he was not saying. His taillights reached the bottom of the driveway and turned onto the road and were gone. And then from the direction of the road, two sets of headlights appeared. One was the silver Mercedes she recognized. The other carried the star of the Harlow County Sheriff's Department on its door. Victor stepped out of the Mercedes looking like a man who has been waiting a long time for a moment and intends to take full advantage of it. Ellis Cobb came around from the passenger side with a folder of papers already in his hand. Sheriff Roy Cafferty got out of the cruiser slowly, his hand on his hat brim, his expression carrying the particular discomfort of a man who has been asked to do something he is not entirely sure is right. Victor looked at the satchel in Claire's hands. He looked at the tire tracks from Stewart's SUV in the mud. He smiled. "Ellis," he said, and Ellis Cobb stepped forward and began to speak, and Claire listened. And the night closed in around all of them, and the vault below the earth held its silence, the way it had held it for 90 years, patient and full, and waiting for whoever was strong enough to keep it. Ellis Cobb had the practiced voice of a man who had delivered bad news so many times that he had stopped distinguishing between the kinds. He stood in the mud in his city shoes and read from the folder in his hands. And what he read was this, that Morrison Environmental LLC had filed an emergency environmental injunction with the county court at 11:47 that evening, citing Blackwood Farm as falling within the buffer zone of a federally monitored remediation project. Under the terms of the injunction, any excavation or subterranean activity on the property was subject to immediate suspension pending EPA review. The sheriff was present not to arrest anyone, but to post notice and ensure compliance. Victor listened to all of this with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on Claire's face, watching for the moment it broke. Sheriff Roy Cafferty stood slightly apart from both of them, his hat in his hands now, instead of on his head, turning the brim slowly in his fingers. He was a large man going gray at the temples, and he had the look of someone who had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when the law was being used as a weapon rather than a shield. Claire said nothing while Ellis finished reading. She held the satchel against her side and looked at Victor, and what she felt was not the panic she might have expected. It was something colder and more useful than panic. It was clarity. "Sheriff," she said, "what are the GPS coordinates listed in that injunction?" Cafferty looked at Ellis. Ellis hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and that fraction was enough. "Read them out," Claire said. Cafferty took the injunction from Ellis's folder before the lawyer could object and read the coordinates aloud. Claire had already pulled up the property map on her phone the one Graham Wells had attached to the deed transfer 3 weeks ago. She held the screen toward Cafferty without a word. He looked at her screen. He looked at the injunction. He looked at the screen again. The coordinates in Morrison's filing placed the so-called environmental buffer zone 1.2 miles west of Blackwood Farm's western boundary line. The injunction did not cover this property. It had never covered this property. Whether through error or deliberate misdirection, Morrison Environmental LLC had filed a legal instrument that did not apply to the land it claimed to restrict. Cafferty folded the injunction slowly and held it against his thigh. Ellis Cobb said, "There may be a transcription error in the filing. We can correct it and refile by morning." "By morning," Claire said, "I will have paid the property tax in full, and this conversation will be a matter of public record." She looked at Victor. "Your lawyer filed a fraudulent injunction, Victor. That's not a transcription error. That's a thing with consequences." Victor's expression did not collapse. It recalibrated. The smile did not disappear so much as retract, pulling back to something thinner and more watchful. He looked at Ellis, and what passed between them was the silent renegotiation of men who have just discovered that the ground they were standing on is less solid than they thought. "We'll be in touch," Ellis said, and his voice had lost its practiced ease. "Through my attorney," Claire said. "Graham Wells, you have his number." Cafferty watched Victor and Ellis walk back to the Mercedes. He watched the car turn around in the mud and head down the mountain road. Then he looked at Claire, and the expression on his face was the complicated one of a man who is both relieved and troubled and not entirely sure which feeling to lead with. "Ms. Ashford," he said quietly, I want you to know I had no prior knowledge of the content of that injunction before tonight. I was told there was an environmental hazard and that my presence was required as a formality. I know that, Sheriff. He nodded. Then after a moment, there's something else you should know. Morrison came to my office 2 days ago. He told me he had evidence related to an unresolved criminal matter from 1933, a homicide. He said there were documents in that vault that could reopen the case. He paused. If he files that with the state, the FBI can assert jurisdiction over any physical evidence in the structure, including the contents. Claire looked at him steadily. Who was the victim in the 1933 case? A man named Henry Blackwood, Cafferty said. Your great-great-uncle, I believe. He put his hat back on, touched the brim once in a gesture that was more human than formal, and walked back to his cruiser. She watched the lights move down the mountain road until they disappeared around the first curve. Then she went back into the vault. Daniel was in the glass office when she came down the stairs, sitting on the edge of the desk with his arms crossed, waiting. She told him what had happened with Victor and Cafferty and the injunction. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked only one question. The 1933 homicide, Morrison filed that as leverage. He thinks the documents in this vault prove something about how Henry died, and he might be right. She moved to the desk and picked up Edmund's letter again, not to read it, but to hold it to think through it from the outside. Edmund believed the Costello family killed his father to take the vault. He believed that for 60 years. He built his entire life around it. But what if he was wrong about part of it? She walked to the post with the carved name and stood in front of it as she had the night they first came down. W. Costello, 1933. I came to take. I left because I could not. She crouched and looked more carefully at the base of the post below the carving, where the wood met the concrete floor. They're barely visible because the letters had been cut shallower than the inscription above was a second line she had not noticed before. She angled her flashlight directly across the surface to catch the relief. Payment made in full. W.C. October 14th, 1933. She stood up slowly. She went to Henry's climate log on the wall and found the entry for October 14th, 1933. Henry's handwriting filled most of the entry, but at the bottom in different ink, W.C. settled. Not stolen, not seized, settled. Walter Costello had not come to take the vault by force. He had come to conclude a business arrangement. He had paid what he owed and signed over his claim and walked away. He had carved his name on that post not as a territorial marker, but as a receipt, as a record that he had been here and had done the right thing. Whatever had killed Henry Blackwood, it was not Walter Costello. She called Morrison at 6 in the morning. He answered without greeting, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had been expecting either her call or word from Victor and did not know yet which one he was getting. I need to meet with you, Claire said, not as adversaries, as people who want the same thing. A silence. Then what thing is that? The truth about what happened in October 1933. They met at the only diner in Harlow at 8 o'clock. A narrow room with 4 booths and a counter, and a woman named Pat who refilled coffee without being asked and had the gift of knowing when not to linger. Claire came with her phone and the photograph she had taken of Henry's climate log. Daniel drove her but did not come inside. He sat in the truck in the parking lot and left the engine running against the cold. Morrison was already in the back booth. He was older than he had appeared on the property, or perhaps the daylight made the years more visible. He had the careful posture of a man who has spent a long time being watchful, and his hands around his coffee cup were the hands of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Claire sat down across from him and put her phone on the table face up with the photograph of Henry's log entry for October 14th already on the screen. Morrison looked at it. He did not reach for it. He just looked. Your family has been trying to clear Walter Costello's name for 90 years, Claire said. That's what this has always been about. He lifted his eyes from the screen. My grandfather left a letter for his children. He described what he did in October of 1933. He described paying Henry Blackwood in full and surrendering his claim to the operation. He described leaving the farm that evening. He wrote that Henry was alive when he left. He paused. Henry Blackwood was found dead 3 days later. His brake line had been cut, and everyone in the county knew that the Costellos had wanted the distillery. The assumption was immediate, and it stuck. My family has lived under that assumption for 3 generations. Who did it? Claire asked. We believe it was a man named Garrett Foss. He worked for the syndicate's distribution network out of New York, not for my grandfather. He had his own reasons for wanting the operation to collapse. When it did, when the Blackwoods disappeared from the business and my grandfather withdrew in disgrace, Foss moved into the distribution vacuum and built something significant. Morrison looked at the phone again. We have a letter from Foss to a business associate dated November 1933 that references obliquely the removal of an obstacle in the Catskills. We have never been able to use it because, without physical corroboration from the vault, it reads as speculation. Claire reached into her jacket and placed a folded sheet on the table. It was a photocopy she had made that morning of the relevant pages from Henry's log, including the October 14th entry. Morrison looked at it for a long time. This is physical corroboration, he said. In Henry Blackwood's own hand, payment received transaction concluded. Walter Costello was not present when Henry died. My attorney can prepare an affidavit attesting to the provenance and condition of the log, Claire said. The original is in the vault, undisturbed, part of the property's documented contents. It's admissible. Morrison picked up the photocopy and held it carefully, the way people hold things they have been waiting for without knowing whether the waiting would ever end. I have something for you as well, he said. From the inside pocket of his coat, he produced an envelope, the paper brown and brittle with age, sealed inside a clear archival sleeve. He laid it on the table between them. This is the original partnership agreement between Henry Blackwood and Walter Costello, executed in 1924, witnessed and notarized. It documents my grandfather's financial contribution to the construction of the vault and his proportional stake in the operation. It also includes a handwritten rider signed by both parties dated October 1933, confirming the dissolution of the partnership and the full transfer of Walter's interest to Henry in exchange for a settled payment. He met her eyes. My grandfather kept this his entire life. He gave it to my father. My father gave it to me. We have been waiting for someone to open that vault and be willing to listen. Claire looked at the document inside its protective sleeve. Then she looked at Morrison. You weren't trying to take the vault, she said. You needed the vault to already exist as physical evidence before the partnership documents meant anything. An agreement between two men that refers to a distillery operation is worthless if the distillery cannot be proven to have existed, Morrison said. Your great-uncle sealed that evidence underground and never told anyone. As long as the vault stayed closed, my family had a story but no proof. And without proof, the name Costello in the Catskills meant only one thing. He slid the archival sleeve across the table toward her. Keep this, he said. It belongs in the vault's provenance record. It's part of the complete story. Claire picked it up carefully. There's a condition I've already attached to the auction of the collection, she said. Every bottle carries the founding names, Henry Blackwood and Walter Costello, 1924. Both names, that doesn't change. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not with the release that cinema would have required. Just a quiet settling, like a house finding its level after a long time under uneven pressure. That, he said, is the only thing I ever actually wanted. She called Graham Wells from the parking lot. She told him about the injunction coordinates, about Morrison's cooperation about the partnership documents. Wells listened in the efficient note-taking way of a man who will sleep less tonight because there is work to do and who considers that a satisfactory trade. The injunction is dead, Wells confirmed. I've already filed the coordinates discrepancy with the county. Morrison Environmental's filing will be formally dismissed by noon. As for Victor's threatened challenge without the environmental angle, he has nothing. The will is notarized before a federal judge. The subterranean rights clause is explicit. There is no legal mechanism remaining through which he can contest your ownership. What about the 1933 homicide investigation Morrison mentioned to the sheriff? A cold case that predates any statute of federal jurisdiction over physical evidence is not a mechanism for seizure, Wells said. It's a red herring and a weak one. Morrison won't pursue it now, and without him, Victor has no standing to raise it. He paused. Claire, you're clear. She stood in the parking lot and let that settle. She was clear. The farm was hers, uncontested solvent. The tax paid, the legal threats dissolved. Beneath the frozen ground of Blackwood Farm lay a collection worth more money than she had been able to imagine 3 weeks ago, when she was sleeping on the floor in a camping bag and crying into her hands from pure exhausted defeat. She was clear, and the thing she felt was not triumph. It was something quieter and more durable. The feeling of having done what was asked of her by someone who could no longer ask. Daniel was leaning against the truck when she came out of the diner. He raised his eyebrows, which was his version of a question. "It's done," she said. He nodded once. Then he opened the passenger door, which he had not done before, and she understood it was not a small gesture. Stuart Crane called that afternoon. He had been on the phone with collectors in London and Tokyo since he landed at JFK and had not slept. He acknowledged with the directness of a man who respects the people he works with, some explaining to do. The syndicate I represent includes 2 collectors whose families have historical connections to the American spirits industry in the 1920s and 1930s, he said. I became aware of the Blackwood Reserve as a theoretical entity through Provenance research several years ago. When Daniel Holt reached out to me, I understood immediately what had likely been found. "You knew about the Costello connection," Claire said. It was not an accusation, it was an accounting. "I knew there were competing claims in the history. I should have disclosed that before the transaction rather than after." A pause. "The collectors I represent want the collection to reach the market with a complete and accurate provenance. Incomplete history devalues rare whiskey the same way it devalues art. The full story, including Walter Costello's role in the corrected historical record, makes the Blackwood Reserve more valuable, not less." "Both names on every bottle," Claire said. "Non-negotiable." "Already into the marketing brief," Stuart said. "Henry Blackwood and Walter Costello, founding partners, 1924. It's the most compelling origin story in American spirits history. The collectors will pay accordingly." The number he gave her was not 80 million. It was higher. The partnership documents, the climate logs, the carved inscription, the corrected historical record of Walter Costello's innocence, the unbroken seal count of more than 10,000 vessels, the extraordinary condition of the liquid. Each element added to the provenance and provenance in the rare spirits market is not a footnote. It is the architecture of value. Victor made one final attempt. 2 weeks after the property tax was paid and the injunction dismissed, Wells received a civil filing from Ellis Cobb, alleging that Edmund had exercised undue emotional influence over Claire to secure her as his heir, and that the distribution of the estate constituted a breach of his fiduciary obligations to his surviving family members. Wells called Claire to tell her about it the same way a doctor calls to report a minor lab result that requires no treatment but is worth noting. "It will be dismissed," he said. "It is frankly the most transparent piece of spite litigation I have seen in 30 years of estate law. But I wanted you to know." "How long before it's dismissed?" 3 weeks, perhaps 4. It cost Victor money to file it and nothing to defend against it. 3 weeks, and 4 days later, it was dismissed. It was the last document in any legal proceeding that bore Victor Harlow's name in connection with Blackwood Farm or its contents. Margaret sent a card, a sympathy card which was either a profound misunderstanding of the situation or a deliberate irony. Claire read it once, set it on the kitchen counter, and did not respond. The restoration of the Victorian farmhouse took 14 months. Claire hired Dr. Patricia Osei, a structural engineer with a reputation across upstate New York for saving buildings that others had given up on. She walked the property on her first day and said with the calm authority of hard experience, "The bones are good. Everything else is just time and money." The house was straightened, stabilized, and refinished, and when the layers of old paint came off the front facade, the original color emerged beneath a deep slate blue that no one had seen for 40 years. Daniel Holt managed the physical restoration of the vault with the same focused attention he had brought to the initial excavation. New climate control was installed with modern precision while preserving the brick and iron architecture Henry had built. A custom security system replaced Edmund's improvised locks, though Claire kept one of the original Medeco deadbolts and installed it on the door to the glass-walled office because she thought Edmund would have appreciated the continuity. She offered Daniel a formal role. He accepted the work without the title, which suited both of them. The Blackwood Reserve launched at a private event in New York in the spring. 40 collectors, 12 journalists who covered the luxury spirits market, 3 museum curators who had come specifically to see the climate log and the partnership documents, and 1 representative from the Costello family, a quiet woman in her 60s named Catherine, who had driven from Philadelphia and stood for a long time in front of the post with her great-grandfather's carved name and said nothing to anyone, and eventually walked back upstairs and thanked Claire in a single sentence and left before the drinks were poured. The label on each bottle read Blackwood Reserve, founded by Henry Blackwood in Walter Costello, Harlow County, New York, 1924, bottled 1933, one of 10,847. The first auction realized $94 million. After Stewart's commission, after Wells's legal fees, after the restoration costs and the back taxes and the $60,000 in bakery debt that had followed Claire from Chicago, like a shadow that couldn't find the door, what remained was a number large enough to be abstract. But it was not the number that stayed with her. On the evening before the first public auction, Claire went down into the vault alone. She carried a single flashlight and did not turn on the overhead lights. She walked the central aisle slowly, the beam moving across the racks, catching the red wax seals, the brass stamps, the glass faces of the vessels that had waited longer than she had been alive. She stopped at the post. She stood in front of the carved name and read it one more time, as she had read it a dozen times since the night they first came down. W. Costello, 1933. I came to take. I left because I could not. Payment made in full. She thought about Walter Costello standing in this exact spot 90 years ago, writing those words, knowing that Henry Blackwood was alive above him, and the agreement was settled, and the partnership was clean and done. Writing it not for anyone who might come later, not strategically, but because it was true, and he needed to say it somewhere that would last. She thought about Edmund, 18 years old, watching his father's funeral with the absolute conviction that the name Costello meant murder, and building 60 years of isolation around that conviction. Living in cold and filth and deliberate invisibility to protect something from an enemy who had not been an enemy, at least not the specific enemy Edmund had believed in. She thought about the waste of it, the long, unnecessary, self-imposed imprisonment of a man who had been protecting the right thing for the wrong reason. And then she thought about the other side of it, that Edmund's protection had worked, that the vault was intact, that the whiskey was flawless, that the truth of Walter Costello's innocence had survived because the physical evidence Edmund had sealed underground had survived. And the evidence had survived because Edmund had been willing to sacrifice comfort and companionship and the ordinary texture of a life to keep it safe. The waste and the devotion were the same thing. You could not separate them. She understood now why Edmund had chosen her, not because she was shrewd or financially capable, not because she would know what to do with what she found. She would not have known. She had not known. She had stumbled through every step of it, from the bankruptcy to the vault to the confrontation in the mud with Victor, making decisions by instinct and necessity rather than strategy. He had chosen her because she had sat with him on summer evenings and not asked about money, because she had listened to the stories about Henry without needing them to be useful, because she was the one person in his life who had wanted to know him rather than what he owned. He had given her the vault not as a reward for that. He had given it to her because it required the same quality that had made her sit with him, the willingness to stay with something difficult without knowing what it would become. She reached out and rested her hand flat against the post beside Walter Costello's name. The wood was cool and dry under her palm. I found it, she said quietly. Not to anyone in particular. To the vault, maybe. To the 90 years of careful keeping that had made this moment possible. I'm taking care of it. She stood there for another moment. Then she turned off the flashlight. In the dark, the vault was not frightening or mysterious or heavy with the weight of secrets. It was simply quiet. 10,000 vessels of the finest rye whiskey in the history of American distilling, resting in the dark as they had rested for 9 decades, complete and intact, and exactly what they had always been waiting for the right person to finally let them be known. Claire climbed the stairs, stepped out into the cool spring air, and locked the door behind her. Above the farm, the sky was full of stars.